I've done plenty of research into this now, and I'm certain what I say is 100% true. There are still parts I don't understand, but that's the reason I wrote this report, so others could give me their own theories. I am 19. I go to school at Angelo State University in San Angelo, Texas. I grew up in Waco, a city in northeast Texas. I lived down there with my mom and my then 18-year-old brother, David. I was 15 at the time. David was a genius. The soon-to-be valedictorian already had scored a fatty scholarship at UT. He wasn't a nerd by any standards. He was a starting basketball player and a powerlifter. A literally perfect child. Anyways, the Smithsonian Society, or one of the national honor things, had a trip for seniors that year to send 15 lucky, young-brain children to Brazil to study plant life. Most people would kill not to go on a trip that consisted of putting leaves in beakers, but Dave went ape crap and begged Mom to go. It was probably 3 weeks he was gone. He left during Christmas break and actually missed the holidays that year, but he loved it, so we were okay with it. So, fast forward to the day he got back from Brazil. He could have skipped about a week of school, justifiably, but he had his first game and he wouldn't miss it for the world. I remember the day he got back. We picked him up at the airport. He looked perfectly fine, healthy and happy. In fact, he wouldn't stop blabbering about the goddamn plants on the way home. I was surprised Mom didn't drive off the road and kill us all just for a moment of silence. It wasn't but a couple days later I noticed anything weird. It was after David's first game. He looked like hell. He was pale, walked everywhere like he was exhausted. He just said it was the first game that blew him out. I didn't have the nerve to tell him he shouldn't be tired because he played terribly and coach hardly put him in. He still got up every morning, went to practice and school, each day looking worse and worse, paler and moving slower and slower. After about a week, my mum insisted he go see a doctor. All of us went. I had to make sure he was okay. I was legitimately scared for him. It was at the office we saw it. He pulled up his shirt to put on a stethoscope of something, and we saw a large green, algae-like growth on the side of his ribs. I can still remember my mom's shocked expression as she shouted, "David, why didn't you tell us about this before?" His only explanation was a blank expression for the whole minute. Even after Mom yelling at him over and over for an answer. Eventually, he managed. It told me not to tell. After that, he was put in the hospital overnight until we could figure out what the hell was going on. It was probably a whole month that he laid in the hospital. I visited him every day, as soon as I got out of school. I could describe each visit, but frankly, they were bland and he said nothing, ever. It was on February 2nd, 2008, that it happened. I was lying in bed, listening to some music, my typical nightly routine before I went to sleep. I felt kind of hungry. I got up and creeped downstairs in hopes of snatching a midnight snack of some kind. It was at least 1 AM and I was tired. My half-blurred vision led me to the refrigerator. I remember hearing footsteps. "Mom?" I quickly but quietly tiptoed to behind the wall where I wouldn't be visible. Then, I heard it. The words that would haunt me forever. David's voice whispering angrily at no one. No, I won't do it. I'm not ready to die." Eventually, his argument with a non-existent voice grew louder until he was nearly yelling. "No, I won't! I won't!" Eventually, I grew the balls to peek around the corner. "David?" I asked, as if to act like I hadn't heard his shouting. I flipped on the light, knowing what I saw would be terrible. But I was wrong. It was terrifying. His eyes were rolled in the back of his head. Clumps of his hair were missing. He had scratch marks all over his body from where he had apparently clawed himself. David looked around, apparently now blind from his condition. "David? It's me, your brother." David looked around and replied softly, just where I was certain of what he said. "Goodbye." Suddenly, his whole body lost control as if he had been tased. His arms flailed for a moment, and he fell over, cracking his head on the dinner table. Blood poured out onto the ground, and his muscles slowly relaxed when he collapsed into a heap on the floor, dead. The police report called it that he died from his condition, not a suicide. Not anything. Just died of natural causes. I made it along. No one believed me when I told them of what I saw, so quickly I stopped telling people. And with a closed casket funeral, I was the only one of our friends and family to see him looking like a zombie. Other than my mom, who was in utter denial about the whole thing, and ended up on a deathbed from similar symptoms herself a couple months later. Like anything else, it just kind of disappeared. After researching the topic and essentially making it my hobby to research throughout high school, I've accumulated the following facts. In certain parts of Africa, Brazil and Thailand, there is a rare fungus known scientifically as Ophiocordyceps unilateralis, or its more common nickname, zombie fungi. It infects certain species of ants and essentially possesses their small brains so they will walk to a decent place for the fungus to reproduce. Then the fungi kills the ant and spreads in its new area. After the accident, I grew a small green clump on my leg. I had it surgically amputated early on before it had the chance to grow. I don't know if David was the first. I don't know if my mother infected anyone. There's a chance though. I don't know about the other 14 kids. However, I do know it is out there. And there is no cure. It's been 2 weeks since the whole thing started. It all started with a tanker accident. It was all over the news. Everyone thought it was just another oil spill. There were plenty of volunteers. Plenty of people wanting to help the poor, defenseless animals. Plenty of victims. Within hours of the tanker accident, it started happening. The animals had gone crazy. They were scratching and biting the cleanup volunteers. They said that it was an adverse effect to whatever was in the tanker. Rescue workers were still trying to get the crew out of their ship. They could hear screaming inside, screams to open the doors. But that's when it all went to hell. As soon as they cut the door out. There was 6 minutes of broadcast before it all went silent. 6 minutes of screaming and agony. The ship crew and rescue workers like rabid baboons, breaking bones and tearing flesh. The people on the shore weren't faring any better. Those that had been attacked by animals were attacking everyone else. It was worse than any war zone report. It was sheer brutality. And yet, the broadcast still went on for 6 minutes. 6 minutes, and then blank faces. Nobody could explain what was happening. They tried to continue with regular news, the economy, the weather, a cute human interest story, but they couldn't make us unsee what we saw. I tried to continue with my regular existence, but every time I switched on the news or walked by a newsstand, it was there. This big mystery. They had some explanations, some kind of infection, brain parasite, but it didn't matter. It wasn't an infection we were afraid of. It was them. 4 days after the initial report, a state of emergency was raised. And yet, we'd all seen this before. Every zombie movie ever. People didn't know who to trust. People were stockpiling food and weapons. Some tried to flee, but it seems every zombie movie was right. They didn't make it. 3 days later, they arrived in my town. I expected moans, shuffling corpses, dismemberment. But that's where the movies lied. They ran through the streets, screaming. I remember running to my front door as fast as I could, locking, barricading, doing anything to make sure it stayed shut. And then I headed for the window. I was on the second story and I could see the carnage. They were unstoppable. They were aware. A group of them made their way through a building across the street. They jumped straight through the plate glass windows. Even the shards slicing through them made no difference. They just kept coming. My barricade wasn't going to hold. I rushed around my flat, grabbing supplies and jamming them into the most secure room of the flat. I went back for one last look across the street, and I wish I hadn't. In the second story window, my face met one of theirs. They knew where I was. I quickly dashed into the room and locked the door. I don't have any kind of panic room or a secure basement, so the safest place I can think of was my bathroom. No windows, one door with a lock. I'd filled my sink and bathtub with water so I could stay for a while. So I sat there, in the dark room, with the distant screams in my ears. I began to feel like I may have overreacted. It had been 2 hours and no sign of them. It actually got quieter and I thought they had moved on. Maybe I could leave the room, get to the kitchen, grab more food to wait it out. A crash came through the front door. The sound of someone running full force into the door and knocking down the barrier behind it. There was a couple more crashes before I knew they were inside. Rapid footsteps moving around the flat. A couple screams, and then a bang on the wall beside me. My eyes were open to their widest, even in the pitch black darkness of the room. Another bang, and another. They knew where I was, and they knew I was scared. This was the zombie nightmare I had been expecting from the start. I had nowhere to run. There was only so much time before they would break in. I sat, with my back to the door, hoping my extra weight would make it harder for them to get in. And then, it got worse. "Why don't you open the door?" A voice on the opposite side of the door. No screams or moans, just a quiet, whispery voice. And then more of them. "We've come for you. You'll be happier if you open the door. It's not so bad." The whispery voices became a cacophony of noise trying to persuade me, to break me, to fool me. I had heard that the moaning of zombies would drive people insane, but this was worse. A siren call. I sat in the darkness and hoped and prayed that they'd get bored. but they don't get bored, and they don't leave. I managed to use the mirror to peek under the door, only to be greeted by horrible, unblinking eyes, blood-smeared faces, screams and more horrible whispers. That was 2 days ago. I don't know what to do anymore. Maybe it won't be so bad. He stumbled. He knew the way, or at least he was reasonably sure he did, but he had a hard time staying on track. He fell. He decided to just stay there for a minute and catch his breath. When he got up, a moan escaped his lips. It didn't hurt exactly, but he was frustrated. He looked up at the afternoon sun and didn't remember it was getting so late. Where did the time go? He just shrugged and walked it off. Home. That was his thought process. I have to get home. He'd been drunk before, of course. There were times where he couldn't remember events from the night of revelry, but he'd never had a substantial blackout before. For the life of him, he couldn't remember what had happened between doing shots at the bar and stumbling around now. At least 16 hours later. Was he asleep? Where were his friends? Why did he only have one shoe? He thought about asking the woman sitting in the park bench. Asking her what? He forgot. He was so confused, but he felt that he couldn't possibly still be drunk. My God, he thought, am I sick? The lady on the park bench was pretty. He moved in her direction. She looked past him. He loomed over her, and she continued to ignore him. Hey, he tried to say, but his words came out as a gasp. Tongue-tied, he stood there, trying to ask a simple question without appearing to be a fool or a simpleton. He just needed to use a phone, if she had one. He grew nervous and agitated. It was like he was stuck in a dream, and he couldn't get the words out. All she did was dismissively grunt in his direction. He knew when to take the hint, so he kept walking home. He wasn't tired, but annoyed and hungry. There was a shadowy spot underneath an old oak. He liked how the moss hung to give him shade. He sat down, leaning against the trunk. He looked back towards the hotel, but couldn't see it. Where were his friends? What had happened to the bachelor party? He didn't remember walking so far, but things had been a mess since waking up. His eyes wandered the streets around him, and he thought it odd how there was absolutely no vehicle traffic. Cars had stopped in some places, and the roads were completely clear in others. Vaguely, he registered the sound of alarms and horns blaring in the distance. He saw a lot of folks walking, not seemingly in a hurry, and completely unconcerned about the heat of the day. He drifted off, tired of thinking, tired of trying to remember and piece it all together. Awareness floated back to him on the beams of a full moon. He was walking again, just as confused as earlier. At least he was no longer hungry. He found it odd he was now barefoot, but he didn't dwell on it. He had to get home. He smiled a little as he remembered being this drunk once before. He was being led back to the hotel from a night on River Street by his less inebriated friends. He became obsessed with the fact that his wife was missing. "Where did she go? Is she okay?" he yelled, and he let out to find her at a full trot. A Keystone Cops moment followed, wherein he ran circles around the old weathered brick building that housed the nightclub, chased by 4 of his closest and dearest. When he finally stopped running, he found her safe and sound hugging a lamppost. The almost sober of the group ushered the concerned parties to the suite before police could be involved. Lost in thought, he tripped over something on the shoulder of the interstate. Wait, the interstate? Headlights in the distance illuminated his path. He looked down at what nearly made him fall. He couldn't tell for sure what it was, but it was slippy and smelled delicious. A food truck accident, he thought. He shambled on towards the headlights, intending to wave them down for a ride. He reached out to them, waving his hands. The car swerved towards him and didn't slow down. Confusion turned to anger when a side mirror grazed his arm. He spun around and landed in a ditch. The car kept going, red taillights in the distance, weaving around other vehicles in the dark. Anger added itself to the perpetual confusion and frustration. He tried to get up, but found his left arm uncooperative. He roared in fury and slowly got back to his feet. He looked down, and in the moonlight, his arm hung limply. It was twisted and obviously broken. Wow, I must really be blitzed, he hazily thought. There was no pain. He walked on. Slowly, the miles melted away as surely as his thoughts. Blackouts became more common. Words became disjointed images in his mind, and soon, the only 2 things that he knew were hunger and the need to get home. Time became a blur. Discomfort became a constant companion, and anger coloured everything with a hazy white film. Days became nights, and strangers shambled beside him. He didn't speak. After it became obvious that they would ignore him, he began to return the favour. He finally recognised the exit ramp for home. He left the pack of weary travellers that had both welcomed and spurred him, and he refused to rest until he could do so in his own bed. His wife and children would be worried sick, and the missus would probably be angry that he hadn't called. She never really wanted him to go off to Savannah with the boys for the bachelor party anyway. These thoughts seeped in and leaked out just as quickly, and it was hard to concentrate. He vaguely remembered being upset that she hadn't come looking for him, but these complex ideas, too, just became images. Home. Hunger. Eat when I get there. Rest when I get home. One foot in front of the other. Fall down, get up, keep going. Home. Hunger. Her. Love. Longing for her. Longing for home. Blackout. He couldn't get inside. The front door wouldn't open. He knocked with his good arm. He beat at the door with both arms in a slow-motion frenzy as frustration mounted and became anger. Ever present under his roiling emotions, that hunger kept gnawing at him. "I'm home. Let me in," he thought he said. But the reality was that only a growl escaped his dried, cracked lips. He heard crying from the inside. Something was wrong. The need to feed flared white-hot, and his fury peaked. He knocked louder, and he yelled for her to let him come inside. His arms flailed against the door, and his growls became a constant moan. Finally, the door opened, and there she was. He saw a flash of light, but he never realized it was the flash of a muzzle. The sound of thunder that echoed into the pines and elms surrounding their secluded country home never reached his ears. He finally stopped walking, moaning and longing. "There will be others. Close the door and let's get the barricade back in place before they get here. We need to bury him, Mama. He's been missing since this thing started, but now he's home and we need to take care of Dad. That's not your dad anymore, baby. He died weeks ago. Under the cover of darkness, as quietly as they could, they laid him to rest next to other family members. Each of them, in that shallow, makeshift cemetery, had been driven by longing and hunger. Each of them had been looking for a missing piece of themselves that could only be found back home.